The War of 1812, America's second war from Britain. If you're ever out of the country or have never learned of the quote-unquote war we had with Britain, you might be confused as to any event of conflict that would start a war. What happened to start another war with Britain, and what happened in it?
To first learn of the start of the war, we must travel to the faraway land of France. Napoleon declares war with Britain, fighting between the two breaks out of the war began. Sparking the Napoleonic War, America at this time is left at a crossroads. They were threatened partners with both France and Britain, and did not want to side with one group. After deciding to remain neutral to both sides, they traded with both France and Britain.
Britain was opposed to this idea. They believed that the Americans were smuggling weapons to the French and blockaded all trade if it was not first checked with British forces. The Americans were not happy. Another thing that bothered both sides was the Navy. Because of the war, British Navy sailors would jump ships on board American vessels and join the American Navy. Britain was not happy. Britain, in turn, started capturing members of the U.S. Navy and put them to work as British Navy. Regardless of whether they were American or British, America was not happy.
The war officially started at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Though the battle had no correlation with Britain at first, it is still considered the first of the war. The scene opens in a ragtag army led under the forces of William Henry Harrison. Harrison met the Indians at the Tippecanoe River on the banks of the Great Lakes. The Indians in the area were not complying with the given treaty of Indian land and were under suspicion of siding with the British. The Indian chief Tecumseh gathered a small army of 1,000 men from different Indian tribes to fight off Harrison's forces. After a long chase of Tecumseh's men, Harrison was met with a fleet of recruited men surrounding him. Under the reserves of men and superior fighting power, Harrison defeated Tecumseh, who would later side with the British. The battle allowed the American forces access to the Great Banks and the British force that followed there.
On September 11, 1814, the Battle of Plattsburgh, also called the Battle of Lake Champlain, was a major American victory. George Prevost commanded a British army and entered into New York State from Canada. Advancing Plattsburgh, British troops soon skirmished with the Americans. George Downey sailed his naval squadron into battle against the smaller American naval force led by Thomas McDonough, who was waiting at Plattsburgh Bay on Lake Champlain. Shortly after the battle began, Downey was killed, and after several hours of fighting, the British surrendered. Prevost called off the land battle, and the British retreated back to Canada. The victory at Plattsburgh influenced the terms of the December peace drawn at Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812.
After a triumphant victory against Napoleon, Britain put all of its attention towards the skirmish with America. The British sent regimes of experienced veterans of the Napoleonic War to fight. The 1st Regiment made their way for the area near the nation's capital under the leadership of General Robert Ross. On August 24, 1814, the British met the American forces, who had more numbers, and fought on the surrounding Maryland area, marking the Battle of Bladensburg. After a humiliating defeat for American General William Winder, the British crossed the Anacostia River into the capital. From there, British took control of and burned the capital to the ground. American morale was at an all-time low as they watched the capital burn in front of their eyes.
The regime made their way to Baltimore, Maryland. The regime sailed their way to the surrounding forts in the area. On September 13th, the British troops made their way to McHenry. The ships fired on the fort for 6 hours, but no permanent damage was done. The people there were amazed at what they had seen. The British kept firing and firing with their overpowering numbers, but made only dents in the fort. Even though the British had a 5-to-1 ratio of men, they could not destroy the fort. Francis Scott Key, who had witnessed the entire scene aboard a vessel, wrote a song of marvelous event that had happened there, and it gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. The flag that was seen in the fort was still flying after the 1,500 shells that had been fired at it. McHenry was not just a victory for the army, but for the people. After losing the capital, the tales and songs of the battle raised the morale of the Americans.
On December 24, 1814, Great Britain and the United States signed a treaty in Ghent, Belgium, that effectively ended the War of 1812. Unfortunately, spreading news at the time was extremely slow, and on January 8, 1815, British and American troops entered in what was remembered as one of the biggest and decisive engagements of the war, the Battle of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson had a modestly assortment of militiamen and volunteers, including free blacks and allied Indians, encountered a frontal assault by a superior British force, inflicting devastating casualties. The main battle took place on January 8th, where Pakenham launched an attack on the Americans. About 1,000 British troops crossed the river to assault the American men on the west bank. A larger British force attacked on the east bank. One reinforced brigade aimed for the left of Jackson's line nearest the swamp, which Pakenham thought the weakest. It was not. Another brigade attacked the right. American cannon, musket, and rifle fire-raked the massed British columns. So effective, in fact, were the barricades of cotton bales, hills in which the Americans had fortified their position, that the fighting lasted only half an hour. The British suffered 2,037 casualties in a mere 30 minutes, including the death of many officers. The Americans suffered only 13 dead, 39 wounded, and 19 captured. The result was a decisive U.S. victory and a British withdrawal. History records no example, wrote Secretary of War James Monroe to Jackson, of so glorious a victory obtained with so little bloodshed on the part of the victorious. News of the victory reached Washington, D.C., at the same time as that of the Treaty of Ghent, and did much to raise the low morale of the capital. The Battle of New Orleans greatly enhanced the reputation of Jackson as a national hero.
What might have happened after the War of 1812, one might say? America came into the war as a divided nation. One might think that that is how they left the war. Well, that is not true. As after the war there was a newfound sense of nationalism across the nation, this newfound identity began to seep in through the cracks of basic themes. For starters, literature was taking a turn to become more Americanized, through the likes of Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper. Staying in the arts, painters began to show an appreciation for the American landscape. Schoolbooks even became American texts instead of British. In manufacturing, certain factories became booming businesses. Americans loved to see these factories sprouting up in their own towns and cities across the nation. It was only a matter of time before nationalism made its way into politics. In 1816, with the declining Federalist Party, nationalists took over by passing the Tariff of 1816. This was a different tariff in that it did not focus on how much money it could make, but rather how to use money to fund shields to protect the American people's money. Eat your heart out, mercantilism.
Well, if you open the door, Henry Clay will run right past it. Side note, get used to hearing his name because he never dies. Just trust us. Anyway, because of this tariff, he wanted to expand on what this tariff started. Henry Clay expanded on the nationalist idea by coming up with the American system in 1824. This system had three basic parts to it. The first was a strong national bank. The next part was a tariff that could help to keep the manufacturing of the East going. This would help secure the money necessary for a system of canals and roads. This would center itself among the bustling Ohio Valley and would help to make trade and delivery of goods from the south to the north and east-west easier. This could connect all the facets of the country together. This, however, was denied, but it still showed how much of a sense of nationalism the United States had after the war, and Henry Clay continued to not die.